There's a member of our synagogue who, whenever his children and grandchildren would come to town during the winter break, every morning he would walk with his little 5-year-old grandson to the synagogue. And he would walk in during the Shachar service and walk up to the pushka that sits on the bima with his grandson and give him dollars to put into the pushka. And he would do this every year, every single day of his grandson's vacation in Palm Beach. Well, this little boy already graduated high school, and whenever he comes to town, his grandfather and I chuckle and say, "This is the tzedakah boy," which was the nickname we gave him. Often, grandparents will tell me, I took my grandchildren on a cruise, on a trip, I gave them Hanukkah gelt, but the most impressive thing to me is when grandparents tell me, "I'm paying for my grandchildren's Jewish education." What we human beings are unique in is that animals also procreate and have children and have a relationship with their children and look after their children. But only human beings have a relationship with their grandchildren. You never see a dog going for a walk with his grandson or granddaughter. This is a uniquely human feature. And indeed, in this week's Torah portion, we find something fascinating. That at the beginning of the Torah portion, we have the first connection, relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild. You see, Abraham, we have many stories between Abraham and Isaac, or Isaac and Jacob, but there's not one story in the Torah about Abraham talking to his grandson Jacob, or Isaac talking to his grandchildren, the 12 tribes of Israel, or Sarah, or Rebecca. But in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, when Jacob arrives in the land of Egypt, he says to his son Joseph, "I never thought I would ever see your face again. And now, not only did God show me your face, but I even got to see your grandchildren." And indeed, before Jacob dies, we find the blessing that he blesses his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, which is the blessing we still use every Friday night to bless our children. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And Jacob is the first patriarch to have an open relationship in the Torah with his grandchildren, so much so that when he blesses them, he says to his grandchildren that you, my grandchildren, should be to me like Reuven and Shimon, which were his first two children, meaning that the love between me and you is the same as between me and my very own children. You are not just grandchildren, you are children to me. And indeed, from here the Talmud learns a very important lesson, that grandchildren are like children. You see, in the Talmud it talks about the obligation of parents for children. And the Talmud says there are 5 things a father and a mother must do for their children. They have to make sure he gets a circumcision. If he's a firstborn child, they have to make sure he gets a pidyon haben, redemption of the firstborn. In addition to that, you have to teach your son and daughter Torah. The 4th thing you have to do is teach them a profession so they could earn a living. And the 5th thing is teach them how to swim so they could survive, especially in the olden days when people traveled by ship, or also today in Florida, especially where there are swimming pools everywhere. But what about your grandchild? So the Talmud tells a story that Rabbi was once walking in the street and he saw Rabbi Yeshua Levi running with his grandson. And he said, "Where are you running?" And he said, "I am running to take my grandson to the yeshiva, to school, to learn Torah." And he quoted a verse in the Torah that says that you should let your children and your children's children know about the Torah, just like the day you stood at Mount Sinai. And Rabbi Yeshua Levi said, from here we see that whoever teaches his children's children, his grandchildren Torah, it's as though he received the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the Talmud says that Rabbi, when he heard this, he made up that from now on, he would never eat breakfast in the morning until he took his grandchildren to school to learn Torah. And from here we learn the obligation to not only teach your children Torah, but to teach your grandchildren Torah. And if you could help provide your grandchildren with a Jewish education by helping support their tuition, that is included in this obligation. However, not only do we find the first relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild in this week's Torah portion, we also find for the first time a relationship between grandparents and great-grandchildren. Because at the end of Vayechi, it says that Yosef witnessed to see 3 generations. Gam b'nei Menashe, his son Menashe, had a grandson by the name of Machir, and he saw Machir's children being born. And the verse says, Yuldu ar birke Yosef, that his great-grandchildren grew up on his knees. And Rashi says, what does this mean? He grew up on his knees. It means that he merited not only to have great-grandchildren, but they sat on his knee and he was able to teach Torah to his great-grandchildren. Not only to his son Ephraim and Menashe, not only to his grandchildren Machir, but Machir's children, 3 generations. And here we see the obligation of not only teaching your children and not only your grandchildren, but even your great-grandchildren Torah. And that's something we all have to think about. If God blessed us to have grandchildren, and especially if we were blessed to have great-grandchildren, we have to make sure that, of course, we should take them on cruises and have fun with them and take them on trips and buy them presents. That's what grandparents do. They spoil their grandchildren. But most important, teach them about tzedakah, teach them about Torah, create memories with them that will last forever. As Moshe Yes in his famous song sings, who will be the Zaidi for my children? Who will be the Zaidi if not I? And Zaidi made us laugh. It's about what the Bubbies and Zaidis, and so often I meet members who tell me I have such memories. My Yiddishkeit came from my grandparents, and you could see how grandparents could have such an impact, a lasting effect on grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I want to conclude with a story that was told by Rabbi Moshe Brisky. Rabbi Moshe Brisky is a Chabad rabbi in California, and he says one time in the summer they had a summer camp, and they took the teenagers to a amusement park and to an arcade, and they were standing around in the arcade, the kids were having fun, and Rabbi Brisky was talking to one of the teenagers when they saw a man take out his wad of cash to get some more tokens or buy something, and he dropped a dollar bill by mistake. And then they saw the way someone went and kicked the dollar to the side, picked it up, and walked away. And Rabbi Brisky said he didn't know what to do. He saw the man steal the dollar from the other fellow. And before he can do anything, this teenager took out a dollar from his pocket, dropped it behind the man who dropped it, accidentally, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, sir, I think you dropped something." Putting his own dollar on the floor for the man to retrieve, and he said, "Thank you." He took the dollar and he went on. Rabbi Brisky said to this young teenager, he said, "It's amazing. I didn't know what to do, but you instinctively went, put your own dollar on the floor and told the man he dropped a dollar. Why did you do that?" And the young man said, "Let me tell you a story." He says, when I was a little kid, every day after school I would go hang out in my grandfather's store. My grandfather had a little grocery store, and I would wait there for my parents to pick me up after school when they came home from work. And my Zaidi loved me so much. There was nothing that made him happier than every day seeing me and kissing me and loving me so much. One day a customer came into the store, and as he was paying, he dropped a dollar. And I saw it. And so I walked over, I kicked the dollar to the side, picked it up and put it in my pocket. I didn't think my Zaidi saw, but as the customer took his bags and turned to go, he started heading towards the door. My Zaidi took a dollar out of the cash register, leaned over, dropped it on the floor, and said, "Excuse me, sir, I think you dropped something." The man came back, picked it up, and left. I was so ashamed, I was so embarrassed, because I realized my Zaidi, my grandfather, saw me steal the dollar. My Zaidi didn't say a word to me. He kept on doing his work in the store. But after a while, I couldn't contain myself. I took the dollar out of my pocket. I went over to my grandfather and I handed him the dollar. And I said, "I'm sorry, Zaidi." And he said, my grandfather looked at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. And he said, "David, from you I expected better." And it pained me so much that I caused my grandfather such hurt and disappointment. When my parents picked me up, he didn't say a word. He said, "When I saw that man drop the dollar, I immediately remembered what my grandfather did. And I did what my grandfather did." And he said, "My grandfather just passed away last year," he said to Rabbi Brisky. He said, "I hope he was looking down from heaven upon me. And I hope I gave him nachas. I hope I made him proud of me." Let us make our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents proud. And let us inspire our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to carry on with the learning and the continuity of Judaism.